Good afternoon, all, and welcome to the final session on today's program, How Do We Build Healthy Cities? I hope you've enjoyed the other sessions today on marmot cities, on the future of cities post-pandemic, on citizen voice, and on the role and agency of local government. These sessions have been recorded, so if you didn't catch them, then please do seek them out. We'll make them available on our various websites. I do need to check with Naomi. Here we go. I've got control now. I'm just going to put a slide up. My name's Daniel Black. I'm the program director of a research consortium called TRUDE. For those who haven't attended earlier sessions, TRUDE is investigating how to tackle, as it says at the top, root causes upstream of unhealthy urban development. It's a 5-year program, 5 universities, 2 city regions, Bristol and Greater Manchester. And as you can see from the logos on the right, there's a wide range of different agencies interested in this. And just very briefly, quick thanks to 2 local developers who've contributed to today's events, Umberslade, forgive me, and Spacia. So this final session is focusing on the private sector. And as the question says here at the bottom, what needs to change to ensure the private sector can play its part in creating healthy places? Now, before I introduce the panel, and we've got a fantastic panel of speakers, and handing over to Rose, one of the panel, to do her presentation, I wanted to just give you a bit of background as to why we scheduled today and why we sought out Bristol Ideas to do that. And I'm just going to use 3 slides to help illustrate this. Very simply, our cities and towns often sadly look like what we have on the left. And obviously this is 2 extreme examples. And maybe when you think of cities, you don't think of these 2 examples. The top left is my particular favorite. Someone tweeted it the other day, and it really is spectacularly bad. And so you may not have urban sprawl, you may not live in bad quality housing, but many of us, especially those in more deprived areas, are significantly impacted by poor quality places to live. Whether that's not having access to nature, having to commute for long periods, leading to inactivity, contributing to pollution, living or working in noisy, polluted streets, and so on. And yet what we want is on the top right, and this is a place in South Germany that's been studied by planners for years. It's dense enough to have good quality public transport. It's as quiet as the countryside, phenomenal levels of walking and cycling and public transport, and loads of other things besides. But it's a very rare example. So how can we do more of this? And of course, the solution is never simple. So this, and forgive me, it's a bit convoluted, but I will explain. This is an early attempt by our pilot research team to try and illustrate as simply as possible the kind of main parts of this system. So on the bottom left, you have effectively major negative impacts on people and planet downstream, and there's lots of evidence around that. In the middle, you have lots of people focusing their energy and attention on planning, design, engineering, and that's been going on for quite a while. But where it feels as though there's a gap is in this sort of more upstream space with regards to health, human and planetary. So with regards to critical decisions and what we're calling root causes being further upstream, whether it's with clients or those who control finance or land, and especially in this country, in the private sector, appear to be a dominant force. But it's also argued, and clearly the case, that these key decisions are not just there, they're also further upstream with national government around a level playing field for the private sector to operate in, for example. And also that power, of course, rests with local government with regards having the power of planning permission. But then others would argue that planning authorities actually have such little resource and actually they don't really have that much power. And so it goes round and round. And to add further complexity, private sector is by no means a single entity. There are a huge number of decision makers and operators, developers, investors, banks, traders, consultants, lawyers, suppliers, contractors, accountants, etc. And they're all operating in a system that's far bigger than them. So where do we start? So this was a pilot study that fed into TRUDE called Upstream, and it helped us just start thinking about this a little bit. there are key themes that it introduced us to through a series of interviews we carried out with senior public and private sector decision makers. And I just want to very briefly touch on these before handing over. So the first one was around valuation mechanisms, which are used to decide on land and development value in other areas. Very easy to count the pounds and the pennies, but not easy to count quality of life, especially over the long term. Also, the critical role of finance. Obviously, without money, nothing can happen effectively. So influence on urban development from investment decisions are enormous. Land, arguably even more critical. You know, it's possible to raise finance and build cheaply, but without somewhere to put it, you've got nothing to put it on effectively. And we're a small island. Land is not easy to get hold of. Partnership came up time and again, but also it's quite a indistinct and intangible concept, not something that can be easily described or nailed down. Issues to do with trusts and shared values and track record. And then there was short-term political horizons, perhaps obvious, yet remarkable simply because of the lack of suggestions of what can be done about it. And also public realm may seem relatively peripheral. By this we mean the space between buildings, our parks, our public spaces, streets. But it's it was in these interviews a surprisingly persistent issue, mainly because developers don't want to maintain it. That's not their job. They build things. They don't look after parks necessarily, and councils can't afford to at the moment. So, and yet it was seen as obviously critical, and is, in terms of our quality of life. Policy and legislation, again, obviously an obvious one, but was characterized by these interviews as potentially quite weak and ineffectual in terms of creating substantial change from the status quo. And while laws like social value are getting a lot of press, like corporate social responsibility, there are questions around impact. And then finally, capacity was notable simply because austerity was clearly profoundly impacting the public sector, according to these interviews, but didn't seem to be affecting the private sector nearly as much. So, a lot to grapple with. And this is just part of the picture and a fairly cursory overview at that. And that's one of the primary reasons for expanding this investigation with Trude. And we are looking into areas of public policy, corporate decision making, real estate, spatial planning, etc. So to help us unpick this thorny conundrum, over the next 50 minutes, we've got a fantastic panel of speakers, as I've said, and please do put your questions or comments in the chat. Down on the bottom right of your screen, there's a little white box where you can put your comments. There's a little button next to it called Ask a Question. If you click on that, you can put your questions in there, and we'll be monitoring those. So over to the panel. Firstly, sorry, just an apology to say Toby Lloyd was unable to make it today. Unfortunately, he contracted COVID at the end of last week. I'm very glad to say that he is recovering, but unfortunately not ready to present. But we're very pleased that he's been so ably replaced by his colleague Rose Grayston. Rose is a senior program manager at New Economics Foundation and was a lead author of the No Places Left Behind Commission. She specializes in housing reform, especially on issues of borrowing, planning, land, incentives, and related policy, and is going to present both the findings from that commission, as well as touch on the issues I've outlined above. And she only has 10 minutes to do so, so it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour, as was mine, I'm afraid. Alexandra Note is Placemaking and Investment Director at PFP Capital. PFP is Places for People, and it's one of the largest, if not the largest, social provider in the country, social housing provider in the country. She's an internationally recognized expert on build to rent, placemaking, and sustainable urban development. She has 16 years strategic advisory experience to public and private sector clients around the world. Matt Griffith is Director of Policy at Business West. He's a specialist in economic policy and has a long history of economic and business research and lobby work. He's previously worked as an advisor to government, including writing reports for the Prime Minister on improving England's economic performance, reports on improving city growth, and several recent high-profile housing reports. And then finally, last but not least, Krista Bondi, my colleague at Trude, who's an expert in corporate governance, is at the University of Bath School of Management, where she specialises in corporate social responsibility, business ethics, environmental management, and power dynamics within and between individuals and organisations. So finally, just a word of thanks before I hand over to our research funders, the UK Prevention Research Partnership, which is made up of 12 different funders from a wide range of different sciences. They aim to prevent non-communicable disease, cancers, diabetes, mental ill health, etc., by investing in novel research. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Rose, and Rose has 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it out for a Q&A with the panel. Thanks, Rose.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and thank you to everyone for making it. Slides going. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Rose. We can see you, but we can't see your slides, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Can you see them now?
No.
No. Okay.
Naomi, can you help? We'll just give it a second to resolve the technical issue. I think there's a little button. If you hover over yourself.
Can you see me? Can you see them now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Sorry for that rickety start, everyone. So yes, I am Rose Grayson, and together with Toby Lloyd, I wrote the recent report, the Create Streets Foundation's No Place Left Behind Commission, which was all about looking at levelling up, what it should mean, and what the role of place in both left behindness and levelling up is. So to start with, what do we mean by left behind places? We tried to sort of put some statistical definition on this, and we considered various different sources, which you can see on the left here. It's definitely not just about deprivation. If we look at the Index of Multiple Deprivation score and we line that up against the Brexit vote, we can see that there is a very weak correlation there. So it's not only about deprivation. Looking at various other sources, we landed upon Local Trust's Community Needs Index, which is a composite measure which looks at connectedness. So transport connections and also internet connectivity. It looks at social infrastructure, it looks at levels of community engagement, and it combines that with the Index of Multiple Deprivation. So it takes the bottom 20% of the IMD and looks at then the bottom 20% of those three indices that Local Trust has put together and uses those to categorize places. And we can see on this measure a very strong correlation between the Community Needs Index and the Brexit vote. What we found is that left behind places, a poor quality of the physical environment, both the built environment and the natural environment, is both a cause of the feeling of left behindness and a consequence of it. So you've often got places with fantastic natural and physical assets. Places like Hull, for example, where there are some fantastic buildings in the city, but they've been very poorly maintained over the years. That then starts to feed a sense of neglect. People feel it as a sign that they are being left behind, that they are forgotten about, that their place, that they do not matter. And it's really the combination of these different factors that matter, because if you are some of the wealthiest wards, some of the places with a very high Community Needs Index score actually have really poor transport, but as lots of people there have high incomes and can drive, they can get to other people, to other places, social infrastructure, and so they're not held back in the same way. It is the combination of these factors that really matter. And when you ask people what would make the biggest difference to your life in a left behind place, it's social infrastructure, it's places to meet. In our No Place Left Behind study, one of the things that we were really struck by was the number of places where there was nowhere for people to meet other than somebody's house. So once the FE college is closed down, once the community centre is gone, once the last cafe is gone, once there is nothing other than houses and basic public services, you're really stuck in a situation where people have nowhere to gather to discuss shared problems and shared solutions to those problems. A quick look at where what this actually looks like. You can see that the darker red and orange places in the map over to the left there, and the darker blue in the map in the middle, These are the places which came out as more left behind on this measure. It captures the places that we would expect, your post-industrial cities and the peripheries of those towns and cities, but it also captures a lot of suburban and coastal places, particularly on the east of England and also some places in the southwest. So it's doing a good job, this measure, of capturing the places that have been discussed as part of this discourse around left behindness and levelling up. But why do we build so many bad places in the first place? Because, you know, while our project looked at left behind places in particular, you know, as Daniel has outlined, it's not like we're building great outcomes anywhere else as well. So the bottom picture here is from Grimsby, but the top picture is from Peterborough, a very prosperous place, which people wouldn't tend to think of as left behind, but clearly building places which are not maximising opportunities for good social infrastructure and for good health. To understand why so many places are so bad in the first place, we have to look at the business model of development, the underlying drivers that determine it. To put this question another way, what are we prioritising when we create places? So very quickly, it's not beauty. It's clearly not beauty. The average national density is 31 homes per hectare, and that's a density that makes it impossible to build well-connected, walkable, car-independent places with good social infrastructure and mixed development. We've got a lot of car-dependent sprawl, and recent research from the Place Alliance into people's experiences of home during the first lockdown found that new development had the poorest experiences of all and experienced the lowest benefits in terms of an uplifting community feeling. So it's not beauty that we're prioritising. Is it affordability? Well, certainly not. 83% of working families currently living in the private rented sector can't afford a new build home, even with Help to Buy, even if we assume they've already got the deposit. If we remove that massive barrier, there's still 83% of families in the PRS that can't afford the homes that we're building. So it's not affordability that our model is prioritising either. What about home ownership? Well, it's not that either. We know that home ownership has been falling. The top line here in blue, when we look at households, when we look at homes and the tenure that homes are in, we all know that's fallen to about 64%. The red line here is a bit less discussed. This is if we look at it in terms of households. So it includes hidden households. It includes people, grown-up children who are still living with their parents, for example. And on that measure, just a little over half of people are living in home ownership. So it's not home ownership that we're prioritising. And to underline this point further, if we look at London, we can see that we now have a four-way tenure split in London if we separate out mortgaged ownership and outright ownership. I think London should serve as a bit of a cautionary tale to other cities around the country. This is, I think, what is going to happen, what is happening in many of our major cities. This is the trend that is emerging elsewhere, and we should not allow that to happen. Is it total supply then? Are we prioritising total supply? Well, clearly not. If you could see along the bottom here, the last time we were building enough homes to meet need was the 1960s and 1970s, when social housing, of course, was making a significant contribution to overall supply. If we look at more recent years, we are getting nowhere near the kinds of numbers that we had for most of the 20th century. So what are we prioritising? We're prioritising property values. Purely and simply, if we look at property wealth as a proportion of GDP, it has been going up and up and up, particularly since the 1970s. And more specifically, to keep cantering through, we mean land values. So land actually makes up 51% of total national wealth in the UK. That is what we are prioritising with our development model. If we look at this, a longer run view of this, we can see that when mortgage finance was deregulated in 1971, we have had an explosion of capital being pumped into the housing market. That has led to the land and housing markets becoming more volatile, characterised by boom and bust cycles, which themselves suppress supply. Because every time prices soften even a little bit, developers stop building, and wait out the crash until prices return and never quite manage to return to supply to previous levels. If we look at this in terms of the regulatory system that has informed this trend in land prices and in house prices, the key thing that I would emphasise is the 1961 Land Compensation Act and the case law coming out of that, particularly the 1969 Myers case, which confirmed that landowners are entitled to hope value in cases of compulsory purchase by a public body. This means that land trades with the expectation of hope value baked in, because landowners have the ability to hold out until they're offered the price they think is right, which tends to be a very high one. This is a patient market. Landowners tend to wait until they are offered the maximum price they think they can get for their land, which is based on building the most profitable scheme possible, i.e. one maximising market sale housing at the top of the market. The only thing that has stopped that in times when we have built more homes in this country is the possibility of compulsory purchase order happening at a lower value. The 1961 Land Compensation Act removed that possibility, and there is now no reason for landowners not to hold out for the price that they want. This is the result. It's worth considering the residual land methodology that in practice informs the value that homes sell at. You'll sometimes hear discussion of the cost of building being the thing which informs house prices. In fact, it's not. The way that developers decide how much to pay for land in a competitive market is they work out how the maximum that they can offer for land based on their own profit expectations and based on squeezing in affordable housing, infrastructure provision and build quality as much as necessary to offer the highest price for land. They have to do that because if they don't, somebody else will. And that other developer will be the one that gets to participate in the land market. They simply won't. Another way of looking at this is this graph here, where we can see, the developer one. It might be what we would want if we are talking about how to create healthy places. You've got the same number of homes as in the others, but you've got half of it as affordable housing, a new park, better infrastructure, and a rapid build rate because you've got lower market exposure. You're maximising local demand. As a result, that developer can pay 20 million for the land. If we look at the other side, developer three, we've squeezed down our affordable housing and our quality. We've maximised market sale housing, and we've got a slow build out rate because of that. That developer can pay 40 million for the land, therefore they win, therefore they get to participate in the land market, therefore that is the development that we get in this country. That simply put is why we have the outcomes that we have. Government has set a regulatory framework which guarantees that developers will act in this way. As a professional campaigner, I think campaigners are very misguided when we focus our ire on developers, because developers are only operating within the regulatory framework set for them by government. We can't expect them to do anything other than maximise profit within that system. There are other ways of doing this. So very quickly, this is Bath. We've got the Peabody Estate. It's not a question of private or public builders. It's a question of prioritising the outcomes of public interest. You've got Letchworth. You've got Arnold Circus. It's not a question of traditional or modern design. It is a question of prioritising good outcomes from development and of controlling land prices to fit with those more aspirational outcomes. Again, you've got the post-war new towns programme, not universally popular in terms of design, but has certainly housed a lot of people and has good outcomes on every possible metric. It's not a question of design, it's not a question of taste, it's a question of prioritising public outcomes and holding down your land price to fit in with those outcomes. So this stuff isn't rocket science. What we need to do it more is a clear vision of high quality development in the public interest. We need to know what we want to do and we need to not budge on it. We need land at low enough prices, and that necessitates reform of the Land Compensation Act 1961. You need a focused delivery agency, which could be a local authority or could be a development corporation or something else. You need patient long-term finance because it does take time. You need a design process that directly involves the community so that you get those right outcomes. And you need construction by a diverse range of high quality builders to make sure that you're maximising local demand. That's my canter.
Oh, no. Yes, I'm on now. Sorry. That was fantastic. Thanks, Rose. That was really, really great. And we originally billed you as a bit of a provocation, and we decided that it wouldn't be provocative, but I think it has raised some questions that I think Alex and Matt will be excellently placed to respond to. I mean, I had so many. I've been writing down some notes here, so I'll come back on those should we have time at the end. But I'm going to hand over to Alex. Could you, what's your take on this? And thinking of the question, how might the private sector respond to these challenges?
Cool. Well, so thank you, Dan, and thanks, Rose. I agree with the majority of what you said, but as ever, it's complicated, right? There's a lot of nuance in there. So the first bit I would say is that whilst Places for People is indeed one of the largest social housing providers in the country, I work for PFP Capital, which is a sort of independent entity. So we are a fund and asset manager regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. And so I represent what is probably the kind of caricature of the evil investor developer like Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, with the money bit. And so one of the things I would say to Rose, it's quite nice to hear someone else defending developers and saying it's not all their fault, actually, because normally that's the kind of narrative. But actually quite often in your kind of aggregate, the profit chunk, most developers are pretty cash poor. So actually a big chunk of that profit goes to the return they have to provide to their investors behind them. And it's actually the investment market that often dictates a huge amount of what's happening here. The other thing is that when I started working in this kind of space residential 10, 15 years ago, I found it boggling that in this country, we're talking about a large scheme and then referring to kind of 70 houses. We're terrible at doing things at scale. And in this country, particularly because we have such professional silos of real expertise in architects or in development or in finance, but that ability to deliver holistic places of the kinds that you've highlighted, Rose, like Bath or Letchworth or, King's Cross is always a really great one that people like to point out for that mix that anyone who doesn't work in it kind of goes, well, why can't you just do more of that? Is actually that it all absolutely does come back to land and ownership and that very kind of narrow, misaligned incentives that we have in this country. I'd love if we had time to get into a whole thing about why it shouldn't all be about ownership and that actually rent can be a positive thing and it shouldn't always be demonized as the kind of the bad plan. But what I wanted to talk about was health. And so even before COVID, because I know that puts a different lens on everything, I was presenting to lots of kind of investor audiences, pointing out that the Centre for Social Justice in 2019 had published research that showed that 43% of UK companies with more than 1,000 employees found that housing issues were impacting their productivity. And 48% of them felt actually that their staff well-being was being impacted by poor quality housing. As I'm sure colleagues on the panel will know, there is something called the Decent Homes Standard, which frankly is a floor level standard for housing in this country. 26% of UK housing does not meet that standard. And I think that's a soft number. And so we have this vast sort of unregulated of the private rented sector. There's a reason that people have this negative perception of it. It's, actually social housing is often much better quality because it's so much more regulated, but that anyone can be a landlord. So in that kind of world, there's really poor quality housing. And so there's poor outcomes there. So wellbeing has been on the agenda for investors and developers and responsible property kind of people for really a significant amount of time. And a bit beyond the kind of the CSR point that you mentioned, we do live in a world of acronyms, I'm afraid, but much more these days it's ESG, which is environmental, social and governance. And that driver, particularly with COVID accelerating it, has really moved things from sort of a tick box greenwashing at the kind of back of an investor deck really to the front now. So there's a huge amount of certainly our investors who really want to see that in tangible metrics and proper outcomes. That's I think something really encouraging. What I think is frustrating in that investment market, as Rose pointed out, the need for long-term capital. I work for a fund where we work with very patient investors with kind of 25, 30-year horizons. And I work on very large regeneration schemes that try to do all the things that you've outlined. So we're very health and wellbeing focused, but we are an outlier. There are not many of us in that bit of the market. So the volume house building sector is in a kind of very different space. And absolutely, as Rose's presentation highlights, it's predicated on scarcity. There's no incentive to them to do anything other than maximize margins and retain land value through pricing. The bits that I think are really exciting for our audience, perhaps, are to see the amount of data that's coming out in much more accessible forms. So much of this has been really, really opaque to anybody who wasn't really deep in the industry. There's a couple of organizations I would like to promote, but one called the Centric Lab, which is some neuroscientists who come out of UCL, who are fantastically bright people creating digital tools and kind of lots of health justice campaigns. One's called the Urban Health Index, another is Right to Know, where you can put in your postcode and it will tell you the air quality, the noise, air pollution levels, the light pollution levels, the deprivation index for that area. And they're really about trying to get regulators and policymakers, as well as developers and investors, to understand that wellbeing is kind of that human right, and that both that public realm point that Dan made at the beginning is really, really important. There's another great one when Rose talked about the importance of places to meet and mingle. Just down the road from us here in Bristol, in Frome, there's a campaign started, a small charity by two mothers called Make Space for Girls, really about trying to prioritise giving teenage girls particularly, who tend to be ignored when well-intentioned developers tick a box with a skate park that's overwhelmingly used by boys, because that is what the evidence suggests, and actually have really pushed a lot about creating safe circulating spaces, particularly for teenage girls, but also actually for young women, which I think in the current environment is something really worth highlighting. Finally, I just wanted to highlight that with kind of COP around the corner, you know, that the great thing is that there is this spotlight that I don't think is going to go away. And I do think the needle has moved in both the investment market and in the developer world to understand that it's not enough to kind of plant a few trees or tick a box, and that there are many, many developers and investors have really strong aspirations in this space to create the quality places that we all deserve. The challenge is, as that kind of research highlights, is that that's expensive to do, and not everyone has the kind of long-term patient capital that we have. Not everyone has the scale or the access to land or the access to delivery that we have. So we work in partnership a lot with local authorities and councils, and we're keen to do more of that. But I think the biggest challenge in terms of, with an eye on COP emissions, is that you guys will probably know that 40% of global emissions are from buildings, existing buildings. What's often not understood is that 22% of those emissions are from residential buildings. So actually it's about retrofitting our existing homes, both rented and for sale. And that's a really big challenge that I think our industry's got to grapple with. Hope that helps.
Thanks. Yes, that's excellent. Thanks, Alex. Loads to think about, and I'm frantically writing notes, but I'm going to hand over to Matt. And I wonder, Matt, as well, if you could pick up on the point about, you know, the private sector and the challenge effectively without some level of government support in creating that level playing field to enable the private sector to respond. But yeah, over to you.
Yeah, exactly. I've got 5 minutes, right? Or thereabouts, as long as it takes.
We can see how it goes.
Really nice to see everyone. I'm Director of Policy at Business West. We are Chamber of Commerce. We represent all sizes and sectors of businesses across the city region. We don't have a direct development interest. We don't do development, but we have played a kind of relatively critical role in place shaping and physical regeneration in city in Bristol over the past 30 years. So, for example, we were part of the leadership group that chivied all the landowners around the harbour side when it was car parks and polluted gasworks to make sure they got together and there's a master plan. And that was taken forward. So a lot of that regeneration. We also stepped in to try and save Broadmead when it was threatened by out-of-town shopping centres and helped Cabot Circus happen. But we're more than, we've always realised that healthy cities, both economically and physically, are dependent upon more than that. So we've set up the culture group that runs Festival of Ideas, because we realise culture is really important. We've set up and co-own the tourism destination group. So we come at it from that perspective that we really care about place, as do most of our members, or all of our members care about place. That's why they join us. I want to make, I really loved Rose's presentation, and a part of my, one of my points is going to be about why the development system is so dysfunctional. That's point 3. But I want to make 3 points contextual really for the discussion, because I think it's important. With the kind of exam question was, how does the private sector contribute to healthy cities? So the first contextual point is that a lot of this discussion is going to be dominated by developers and the built environment and good, bad, indifferent, etc. But I guess the obvious and often ignored point, because when we talk about cities and the private sector, we default into development. But actually, in terms of business, it's a small component of a business base. And it's what's most important for the private sector and business health and health outcomes is all the things they do in terms of creating meaningful work, raising incomes, providing tax revenue to invest in public services, and also in providing the dynamism to provide solutions, whether that's long-term solutions or it's harnessing enthusiasm of staff. So you really need to get worried if business starts failing in the core of that stuff, because then places start to fail and health outcomes start to fail. And Bristol luckily hasn't had that in the way that some parts of the city have. But if you look at some places where it has failed, like Hartcliffe, where there was the withdrawal and closure of the major Wills tobacco factory, the social outcomes and the health outcomes that resulted from that were very severe. So point 1, private sector is important. And on top of that, it can really help with solutions. So if you look at all the things that are going on at the moment, business is really interested, particularly now, about how to retain staff, how to motivate staff, how to make the best of staff, how to make staff want to join your company. And that means like really exciting mental health initiatives, a much higher emphasis than it used to be. Active travel, lots of our businesses are getting behind active travel and trying to shift away from congestion and pollution. HR across most businesses will put a lot of effort into trying to make sure their staff are healthy going forward. So I guess the question for city leaders is, how do you harness that in terms of making solutions work? So that's point one. Point two was just a general observation really about the fragility of a lot of the private sector and its role with government, because maybe this is just having to deal with Brexit for 5 years, but a lot of the current political discourse is business causes all the problems. And if we can only find a way of hammering business over the head hard enough, they will deliver the solutions. And actually, that you can see that in the kind of current debate about skills and incomes and inflation and skill shortages. But actually, it's much more subtle than that, in that businesses are very dependent upon good government to be able to deliver business health, and also on business public goods and health outcomes as well. And in many areas, in fact, nearly all areas, business wants government to hold the ring and provide really decent, a level playing field that is enforced in order to get obviously good business outcomes, but also strong public realm outcomes on which business depends. So this is things like good regulation and strongly enforced regulation, law enforcement, standard setting, and wider public goods like skills, education, infrastructure. All those things really matter to business, but business isn't the one who's delivering. Those are political choices, and choices often delivered by the public sector. So that's really critical. And the private sector wants those to be fair. It wants long lead-in times, but it wants consistency, and it wants them to be there, because otherwise it destroys a good business's business model, because they'll be undercut. And interestingly, on the health front, the most visible example of that recently in Bristol is around clean air zones, which are going to be enforced next year. If you look at what clean air zones have been driven by, it has been international standards and regulations. So the UK lost a court case because it was failing to enforce European health standards. It then, in providing a solution, the UK government has been using European vehicle standards, the Euro 5, Euro 6, to ensure that pollution levels from vehicles are driven down. And the industry has very successfully, over many years, had a regulatory framework which made it get better health outcomes in terms of pollution outcomes. And the move to the electric vehicles by 2035 is just another one of those. And in terms of the clean air zone delivery, actually most of the obstacles for business are local. It's poor transport infrastructure, which means that their staff don't have another choice in terms of getting in their vehicle. And once the clean air zone is introduced and vehicle emissions decline, the main contributor to pollution will be individuals burning wood from the comfort of their living home. It won't be businesses. So again, regulation really matters, and getting it right really matters. So my final point, and this is where you'll find a surprising amount of commonality with Rose's presentation, is that the development sector is a unique case, right? In fact, it's downright weird how it operates. If you were to talk to a normal businessman and show them how the development sector operates, they would go, "Oh, I don't understand this." And in many ways, the market rules kind of get thrown in the bin. But it's really important to understand, because it delivers really important physical infrastructure in places where people live, and people that feel very close to their built environment, because it's an identity for them of the city. It needs to be good, and it has all kinds of important outcomes. So why is it so weird? Point one, land is inherently scarce, right? That's just the nature of it. So if you want to build a development by the harbour side, it has to be the harbour side. You can't kind of do it in a field in Gloucestershire. So that's makes it the dynamics of how the market operates different. Point two, which massively reinforces problems here, is government deliberately creates scarcity, and the release of that scarcity is highly politicised. And it is done in a very weird way. The UK is much weirder than everyone else compared to Europeans, who do it in a kind of zoning and different ways in which they assemble land. And the Americans also do it better, amazingly. So release is highly politicised, and there's not enough release. Also, point three, market performance is highly dependent upon government whim, really, upon planning gain. So a lot of your performance will be you want to build the best house and the best flat, but actually the uplift is basically whether you get planning permission, which involves a political decision with lots of local opposition. So it's really not like making dishwashers. In addition to that, there are a couple of other things which make it tricky. The first of those is that the market is just inherently volatile and cyclical because it's a reflection of wider credit conditions. It's a reflection of obsession with house prices, and it crashes every so often. So there's a lot of risk in that market, and developers tend not to go bust because they build bad homes. They tend to go bust because they mistime the cycle, and they go bust that way. So it's a very risky market, and you don't want to be overexposed, and that conditions the way they operate. The other one is that we've got to a situation which, instead of trying to get public goods paid for by the general taxpayer, we understandably think, oh, there's a massive uplift in gain from development, therefore we want to tax it. And that's fair enough. But it does mean there's a great emphasis, and the main tool is by trying to tax development uplift through this thing called Section 106. But actually, if you think about it, affordable homes, you should really try and tax affordable homes by taxing existing wealthy homeowners via higher council tax or higher inheritance tax, etc. things, rather than a more cyclical thing. And government is kind of queuing up with public goods it wants through development uplift. That's fair enough, but it starts to get a bit crowded. So you want net zero homes, you want transport and road infrastructure, and because it's unclear and because it's very cyclical, developers will understandably try and wiggle out of the system and try and will try and negotiate down because they've paid a hell of a lot for land. And the thing that exacerbates that is basically there's a phrase in the development industry that whoever miscalculates the most wins the site. So there's an incentive which roads put forward to overbid and then kind of work it through from there. So either try and build more or try and negotiate down. So we have a really volatile, unclear planning system that's full of risk, and the developers find themselves overbidding and then have to kind of make it all stack up. That's just kind of comments on Rose. I kind of often see developers as often the victims of the system in as much as perpetrators. And the problem with this is it's particularly acute in Bristol because we're close to London, we've got massive price pressures, we're very tightly bounded, we don't have much land, and government has just announced a 35% uplift to residential targets. So we have to build even more houses, which means obviously pressure on all kinds of things. So closing statements, what would I say? First, don't forget the wider power of businesses and the dynamic they can provide, providing better outcomes. They want to provide solutions if you can partner with them. Secondly, level playing field is critical. Third, trying to tax development gain uplift requires really substantial reform, and I would agree with Rose there, but it's very hard. And fourth, the thing for me is we really need to get back to the understanding the wider role of the public sector in providing public goods and invest in it. At present, it's really undervalued and invested, which makes outcomes really hard. So we don't properly fund planning teams in local authorities. We don't properly fund master planning either at local level or city region level. We don't invest in the public realm enough, and we don't protect and invest in transport, parks and other things that matter. So that's it from me.
Thanks, Matt. That was really, really fantastic. So much stuff to be talking about here in so many different areas, and just not nearly enough time, I'm afraid. So, I do want to hear from Krista as well. So I'm just going to pick up on one point. We've spoken about corporate social responsibility and ESG, which are economic and social governance. Krista, this is your area. Can you just talk to this briefly, as well as responding to Rose and other comments you've heard, and then we'll pull it back to some questions from the audience.
Yes, thanks, Dan. And thank you. I really enjoyed that, Rose. I thought that was really excellent. And thank you also to Alex and Matt. Those have been very interesting comments. I'm sitting here trying to reflect, and what does it all really mean? You know, if we start trying to bring some of this together, because what it sounds like to me is we have a situation where there's quite a strong feeling of blame. And I think it's really interesting because when you talk to different stakeholders, they all feel like they're being blamed for these same situations, right? You know, the protesters aren't doing it right, or businesses are the devil, and government isn't regulating appropriately. And so there's all of this blame flying around. And I think what that blame is actually masking is the fact that we're not really sure how to create this kind of holistic development. So, I mean, Alex, you were saying something about how do we do it, right? How do we create these holistic areas? And we've got a couple of success stories. But again, it's actually even broader because we know we need to then start to really tackle, for instance, the climate agenda, net zero. We've got some legislation in place in the UK. How are we going to actually start to bring all of this together and start to create some of those broader connections? Because of course, what we've been talking about at the minute, we've been talking about all of these stakeholders as being pretty homogenous, right? Business does this, government does that. And of course, it's not like that at all, right? It's so heterogeneous. So as soon as you start talking about, well, developers act like this, then you have, a number of different examples where that isn't the case. And so I think for me, it sounds like what we've got is we've got this, we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out why we're to blame, but perhaps, it's about trying to figure out what those interconnections are. And that's where the really difficult part is. And we don't really have great answers for that yet. How do we start to create those better interconnections? Because, for instance, partnerships, Dan, like you were talking about with the Upstream project, partnerships, again, are just a tool for bringing people together to collaborate. But of course, partnerships are also used to lobby and create all kinds of what in my world we would call perverse regulation, right? Regulations that enable all kinds of abuses of the system and making sure that we're not getting what it is that we're wanting to get. So if I strip this back to kind of a corporate social responsibility or ESG perspective, and I take your point, Alex, that in different fields we call it different things. So, in the finance world we call it ESG, so environment, social, and governance. Corporate social responsibility, for certain industries out there, they say, that's now PR washing. We don't care. We don't call it that anymore. Now we call it sustainability. These terms move because, of course, it's just a tool. It's a tool to represent a set of behaviors where organizations should be trying to engage meaningfully in a broader set of values and a broader set of activities that reflect what society needs. So going back to what you were saying at the very beginning, Rose, how do we get what society needs, right? And one of the things that I find very interesting is that when we start to look at the power dynamics across these different industries, when we're trying to look at how do we bring all of this together, how do we create those interconnections to create these kinds of holistic and when I say holistic, I mean that also incorporate a different way of viewing it, the different values. What we then have are people who say we're not powerful enough. Well, we can't do it. It's not our fault. We can only do this tiny little piece. It's actually the developer's problem, or it's the local council's problem, or it's the financial investor's problem. And so that's where we get into the blame culture very quickly, is because we don't see ourselves as having much power to be able to create those connections because of those silos. So then where do the ideas come from? And of course, that's what we're trying to do on the Trude project. We're trying to work with people to see where the ideas are, where we can come up with them ourselves. And of course, it's a real challenge. So I guess in hearing all of your comments, I think that there's so much value in what we've been talking about today. And from my perspective, I think the key thing that we need to be looking at is how do we create that integration beyond that blame game? So how do we actually stop blaming each other and saying, okay, so right, what does it actually mean for instance, Alex and her company to work with a developer in such a way that, the land value shifts, as you say, that the value for land is depressed so that then the social goals can be brought into place. And I mean, we've got a lot of work to do, I think, to be able to figure out what those real and meaningful interventions are going to be. So I don't have the answers. I wish I did.
Thanks, Krista. That's really helpful. Before I move away from you, though, I do want to get a specific response on corporate social responsibility and ESG, because, I mean, there's been a lot of, particularly for people in our sector, there's been a lot of discussions around this area. There was the former exec from BlackRock saying that, it's all greenwash, effectively paraphrasing. But is it all greenwash? Is the answer going to come from the private sector, or do we need government intervention?
I have to have both. All of the sectors have to be involved in the solution. I think the reality is that governments provide the framework and are more responsible for the rules of the game in which organizations act, although organizations can have a substantial influence on that, right, through lobbying and different kinds of secondments and those kinds of things. So the rules of the game are set by government. So government has to be a key player in setting what those rules are going to be. Corporate social responsibility is just a tool. ESG, it's just a tool. It's a way of framing a set of activities. For many industries and for many organizations, largely CSR is greenwash. But that's because the organizations often are selecting. It's a voluntary set of agreements, right? Organizations are themselves selecting what they're going to put into the CSR pot. Now, when you have kind of industry grouping, sometimes that's different. So for instance, the responsible care industry with regard to the chemical companies, that's a more robust industry level set of guidance in terms of what a company should be doing with regard to their social, environmental, and perhaps economic. So I'm not talking just about financial here. I'm talking about broader economic goals, such as issues of social justice and that kind of thing. So corporate social responsibility is just a tool that gets used and abused. It's just a term that gets used and abused. So it's greenwashing or blue washing, depending on who's using it. But there are some organizations who are taking it quite seriously. And I think those are the ones where we want to try and support those kinds of efforts. So governments taking what those organizations are doing and using them as the model in regulation and guidance that gets used, because that starts to create a bit of, bring the free riders up a little bit more. And then it can create a benefit, because we've talked quite a bit about the business case. There have been a number of people talking about different parts of the business case. So, companies retaining staff because they're doing a better job of whatever. So this business case, it can be quite influential and is a way of doing it. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. And I want to hand over to Alex to ask. I know, Alex, you've done a lot in ESG as well, but I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier on. You said developers are cash poor, and I suspect there are a lot of people that would
often.
Yeah, but I suspect a lot.
It's a boom and bust
I want to
ride.
unpack that slightly. Could you just say what you mean by that? Because I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily understand the difference between cash flow necessarily and other forms of monies flying around. So yeah, could you just expand that?
All right, I'll get to that. But I want to just clarify that I agree with Krista to the point that CSR is often greenwash. For me, I define CSR as what has been talked about as often in marketing departments, staff volunteering for charity days and that kind of thing, and things people can feel good about, which is fine. It's a nice thing to do. ESG is much more about trying to provide fundamental metrics. One of the exasperating things has been there's been a proliferation of like over 500 different metrics globally, and there is now a bit of banging heads together trying to get some commonality between them. One of the things that came out of the Paris Climate Agreement was something snazzily called TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Finance Related Disclosures. Without boring everybody silly, that is going to lead to some serious regulations. I'm involved on various committees, and the FCA are going to end up adopting something that will mean that not just real estate, but any businesses, asset managers, pensions, investors, institutions are regulated on climate reporting. So it is coming, and I think that will be a massive shift in terms of embedding ESG into not just as a tick box at the end, but into kind of core accounting and methodology and business practice. So I think that's really good for everybody. The challenge is kind of to Matt's point of the segregation between the big players like us who can afford to and have to do it and invest in it because we have long-term money and we work in partnership. To answer your question, we are not representative of the bulk of the house building market. So we are a very large institutionally back now. We have pension fund investors. We work with preferred development managers who are specialists and experts. So Spatia, one of the sponsors of today, are one of our partners. We work with really reputable people and we have a good control of the supply chain. One of the challenges in development, exactly as kind of Matt outlined, is the bonkers fragmentation of the way that it's structured in this country, and that essentially cost is kind of loaded very, 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 very heavily front loaded. So developers make their money when they've sold stuff, when they've finished it. And if it's gone well, they make a profit, but they have to pay off the kind of investors and everyone else. And if it hasn't, they make a loss and they're in trouble. To all of Rose's points about land value that requires kind of a massive uplift, that dictates all of their kind of cash flow all the way through a project. So quite often developers, are working on the basis that they will get a fairly chunky return at the end, but it's based on a really quite risky cash flow profile, very, very different to any kind of P&L that you would have in a normal business. It's not to excuse some of the poor schemes that you see, but I think to some of the points that other colleagues have made is that you can have every good aspiration of the kind of place you want to create, but it gets chopped out by the slowness, particularly of the planning process, the slowness and the risk that your risk increases. And if you've borrowed money to develop from a bank or a lender or an investor, you are paying interest on that money from the day that you've borrowed it. So if your planning is dragging on because you're trying to do something bold and creative and risky, so is your cost of money. And fundamentally, that can't carry on indefinitely. And so I have seen a number of schemes where people had really bold aspirations that they in the end gave up and did something a bit more basic just because they couldn't take the risk financially anymore.
Thanks, Alex. It's a really important point. And risk is something that obviously just comes up time and again and could be at least another hour, if not several years, just talking about that. I did just want to pass it over to Rose. We've had a question from the audience that I think speaks to this and follows on very nicely from what Alex has just said. And just to say, we do only have 5 minutes left, unfortunately, so we are going to have to start wrapping it up soon. But the question is, I don't know if you can see it, but it seems that we're in a very opaque planning system, a dysfunctional market. This is from Nicolette Bota. How can a powerful coalition of diverse public, community and private actors be built to drive change? Difficult question, but I think you're best placed to answer it.
I'll try and also respond to some of the other panelists' comments at the same time. So I really do believe that land value capture is the most profitable route for us to be looking at. I absolutely agree with what Matt mentioned about taxing wealth. I would be well up for that. I do not think it's going to happen. Whereas I do think we have some hope of reforming the Land Compensation Act, which would allow us then to set much more ambitious affordable housing and infrastructure requirements on the new schemes coming through. I think that is a realistic possibility, not least because just before the pandemic, we had a chancellor, Sajid Javid, that was up for this. We had a chairman of Berkeley Homes, the late great Tony Pidgley, who was up for this. There has been a coalition of support for this idea, including from some quite unexpected places. That at one point, Theresa May's government was up for tackling this issue, and I think we can get there again. Winston Churchill was a big fan of these ideas. And we of course have a prime minister that is really sympathetic to Churchillian arguments. So I do think there is real hope here, not least because it can directly improve the development outcomes that we get from development today. We are talking here about improving the levels of social infrastructure, the healthiness of places, the affordability of housing, the design quality of new communities. There are immediate benefits for people living today from this change, and that's how I think we need to sell it. And obviously there are sort of different arguments to be made for different people. So one thing I'd like to raise is that from the point of view of developers' risk and managing cash flow, well, social and affordable housing is a great thing because you can sell your social housing in one big block to a social housing provider. You can get some cash in early on in the development. You can de-risk the rest of your scheme in that way. Whereas I think while I completely recognise what some other panelists have raised in terms of we're loading far too many requirements onto current land value capture mechanisms, and development can only bear so much. I'd suggest that sort of saying, well, let's skip over the affordable housing and do that some other way is, not what people have said, but if we were to compromise on that bit, I think it would be a bad thing for everybody. I think it would be a bad thing for developers' risk as well. So to answer the audience member's question directly, I think it's about different people in their different fields all talking about the benefits of making this change, talking about the cost of not making it as well, which I think we're a lot better at, but talking about what could be achieved by what Sajid Javid, when he was briefly Chancellor, was considering, which was a 50-50 split in planning gain between the landowner and the public interest. Now, that wouldn't personally be my policy recommendation. I don't think there's great evidence behind it. But for example, that is something that has had a hearing from Conservative-led governments recently. What would be the benefits of that? What would it allow us to do differently in terms of better infrastructure, better affordability of housing, better design quality, and so on? But I also think it's about coalescing around one change as well, not having lots of different suggestions for lots of different types of change. That's a challenge because there are different ways of doing this, but I think we have to pick the way of doing it that is most likely to succeed, and for me that is land value capture, and it relies on reform of the Land Compensation Act 1961. Maybe a bit techie, but that's why it's so important to focus on the benefits.
Thank you, Rose. That's really great. We are coming up to the end, and I saw Alex shaking her head at one point. So, and unfortunately, Alex, you're not going to have a chance to respond to that. But I just got a yes/no answer for each of you before we sign off. I did just want to say something about the land compensation in the pilot that I mentioned earlier on, and there was a reference to the paper. If anyone's interested, there was of the 15 people we interviewed, I think 14 of them were all supportive, both public and private sector, of some rejigging of land compensation, but one said it would be very dangerous. So read into that what you will. But so the question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to start with Matt, who hasn't had a chance to speak for a while. But the question is the current system broken? Yes, no. And how radical a change is needed, big or small?
So it's clearly not functioning very well, right? So it needs reform. In terms of the development system, it's like how you do it and how you build a coalition to do it and how you do it in a practical way that will work. So that could be pretty big, but the politics is quite short-termist, and it's getting around that.
Well, thank you. Not a yes/no answer, though. We're just looking for a yes/no answer. Krista, yes/no. Is it broken? How radical a change is needed?
Yes, the system is broken. Radical change is required.
Okay, thank you. And Alex?
Yes, massive.
Good. Rose?
Yes, revolutionary.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much indeed. And thanks, everyone. We're pretty much on time. As we said earlier on, these are being recorded, so please do check them out and pass them on. I'm sorry that we haven't had a chance to look at all the questions that we had from you. But yes, thank you for everyone for turning up, and thanks to Bristol Ideas and everyone else that put so much time into making this event happen. Thank you very much.